The wind howled, a mournful song through the gaps in the corrugated iron of Haskell's boatworks, a sound Ben had grown intimately familiar with. January in Port Lament, Maine, wasn't known for gentle weather. It was a time for hunkering down, for the sea to rage, and for Ben to wrestle with stubborn engines and the ghosts that clung to the salt laced air. He tightened a bolt on a Yanmar diesel, the metallic scrape echoing in the cavernous workshop. Snow lashed against the single grimy window, blurring the grey December light. He wiped grease-stained hands on a rag, the scent of oil and brine, a constant companion. The shop smelled like work, like survival. He preferred it that way. He glanced at the chipped ceramic mug warming on the small stove. The coffee within long since cold didn't matter. The caffeine had ceased to make a difference years ago, numbed by something far colder than the Maine winter. The bell above the door chimed, a fractured jingle, swallowed by the storm. Old man Tiber, bundled in layers of oilskins, shook the snow off like a disgruntled bear. Haskell, Tiber rasped, his voice thick with the local accent that hadn't thinned with time. Got a looking problem. Figured you're the only one crazy enough to be working in this mess. Ben grunted, gesturing towards a half-disassembled outboard motor. Crazy, or just avoiding things, Tiber. Always a fine line in Port Lament. Tiber didn't rise to the bait. He merely hauled a heavy wooden buoy onto the concrete floor. It thudded with a wet slab, leaving a dark stain as melting snow trickled from its surface. The rope was frayed, chafed through in several places. Found it snagged in my traps. 'Bout 5 miles southeast of Monhegan. Thought it might be a marker gone astray, but look at this. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the buoy's surface, carved into the aged wood, with a precision that belied the rough ocean surroundings, were a series of lines and notches, not the usual identifying numbers or the lobsterman's tag. These were intentional. Ben knelt, his own hand hovering over the markings before he touched them. The wood was cold, slick with moisture. It wasn't the random gouging of a collision. Someone had purposefully shaped these symbols. A familiar, unwelcome prickle ran down his spine. He hadn't felt this sensation. The instinctual pull of dread in a long time. The squall had come fast, turning a calm November afternoon into a furious grey chaos. Ben, then a young Coast Guard rescue swimmer, remembered the frantic mayday call from Hemlock's sea serpent. Old Man Hemlock, they called him. Crusty, independent, scoffed at weather reports, a fixture on the waters for 70 years. Squall line combing, in hot, Hemlock. The dispatcher's voice had crackled over the radio. Advise returning to port. Hemlock's response had been typical. Bah, she'll blow over. Just a little chop. Got a good haul. Ain't turning back for nothing. Famous last words. Ben had been lowered from a Jayhawk helicopter into the monstrous waves, the spray blinding, the wind snatching at his harness. The sea serpent was rolling violently, a tiny speck against the overwhelming power of the sea. He'd reached the boat, found it largely intact but empty. The emergency beacon was broadcasting, but Hemlock was gone. He'd searched for over an hour, the waves relentlessly pounding him against the hull, the cold seeping into his bones. Visibility was near zero. The decision was made. They had to evacuate. The image of Hemlock's empty oilskins, draped over the wheel, haunted Ben still, heavier now with the passage of time. The feeling, the sickening certainty that Hemlock hadn't simply fallen overboard. Something else had happened, something he hadn't been able to uncover. The official report had ruled it an accidental drowning, a tragic but unremarkable loss at sea. The town, bewildered by the death of a local legend, had mourned. But whispers followed Ben, the unspoken accusations hanging in the damp air. He'd been the last person near Hemlock. He hadn't found a body, and the sea, as it always did, guarded its secrets. He transferred off active rescue duty 6 months later. The waves had started to talk. He wasn't sure if it was the trauma or a growing sensitivity to the ocean's moods. but he couldn't shake the feeling that the water held memories, held judgments. He needed to be away from the constant reminder. He'd bought the boatworks, hoping the mechanical rhythm of repair, the solid tangibility of engines, would ground him. It hadn't entirely worked. "You remember old man Hemlock disappearin'," Tiber said, interrupting Ben's reverie. "Folks still talk about it. Some say he just got pulled under. Others say you didn't look hard enough." Ben's jaw tightened. The accusation, veiled as idle chatter, still stung. He'd faced the inquest, the quiet hostility of the town, the subtle questions from his superiors. He'd offered every explanation, every detail he could recall. It hadn't mattered. The shadow of doubt remained. "Tiber, we've been over this 1,000 times, Ben said, his voice carefully neutral. "I did everything I could. Just sayin'." Tiber shrugged, unimpressed. "Always felt odd. Hemlock knew those waters like the back of his hand. Didn't just fall in." He paused, then added, "Saw Ellie Mae down at the diner this morning. She was ragging on it again. Said Hemlock had been messin' with something he shouldn't have. Smuggling, she reckoned." Ellie Mae Henderson, the diner owner and resident gossip, had a knack for conjuring conspiracies. Ben dismissed her ramblings most of the time, but the seed of unease she planted always took root. "Ellie Mae's been embellishing stories since she was knee-high to a grasshopper," Ben said, turning back to the buoy. He traced the carved lines with a calloused finger. The pattern wasn't random. There was a structure to it, a deliberate arrangement. "You recognize anything?" Tiber asked. "Not immediately," Ben admitted, but he felt a growing disquiet. He'd spent years studying maritime charts, navigational signals, distress flags. He knew the language of the sea. This felt familiar, yet alien. He retrieved his battered laptop, booting it up and pulling up an online database of maritime flags and signals. He started to painstakingly compare the markings on the buoy to the images on the screen. Nothing matched exactly. The system was slow. The internet connection in Port Lament, notoriously unreliable. He scrolled through countless variations of signal flags, each representing a specific message: man overboard, require assistance, vessel not under command. None of them fit the strange arrangement carved into the wood. He zoomed in on the markings, enhancing the image. The lines weren't simply lines. Some were slightly angled, others were subtly curved. They almost mimicked the shapes of flags, but distorted, fragmented, a nautical alphabet, but a corrupted one. He switched to another database, one devoted to obscure historical signals, dating back to the age of sail. He unearthed it years ago while researching a particularly challenging restoration project, an antique schooner commissioned by a wealthy collector. The collector had been fascinated by the secret languages of the sea, the coded communications used by smugglers and privateers. The screen flickered with images of ancient flags, complex semaphore systems, and forgotten naval codes. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his heart rate quickening. He stopped at a page detailing a series of coded signals used by a notorious pirate captain operating off the Maine coast in the late 18th century. The shapes. They were close. Not exact, but unsettlingly similar. He magnified the image of a particularly obscure signal, a combination of lines and angles used to indicate a hidden cove, a rendezvous point. The lines in the pirate signal were cleaner, more precise, but the underlying pattern, the overall arrangement, was strikingly similar to the markings on the buoy. It was like a distorted echo. He spent the next hour dissecting the carvings, comparing them to every maritime signal he could find, his frustration mounting. The pattern was just beyond his grasp, hovering tantalizingly at the edge of recognition. Finally, he noticed something he'd missed before, a subtle detail hidden within the overall design. One of the lines wasn't a line at all. It was a series of tiny, almost imperceptible dots, Morse code. He quickly transcribed the dots and dashes onto a piece of paper. It took him several tries to accurately decipher the fragmented code, the carvings crude and uneven. When he finished, he read the message. 3 words: "They are watching." A cold dread settled over Ben, heavier than the January storm. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. This wasn't about a lost fisherman or a wayward buoy. This was a message, a deliberate warning, and it felt inextricably linked to the past. He looked back at the buoy, at the strange, unsettling carvings. The markings weren't random. They weren't a mistake. They were meant to be found. And whoever sent them knew exactly what they were doing. The chipped ceramic mug finally held steaming coffee, a meager comfort against the chill that had settled deep in Ben's bones. He hadn't slept. The message, the moon, "They are watching," firmly looped in his mind, a relentless static disrupting any attempt at peace. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours poring over his collection of nautical manuals, dusty relics salvaged from estate sales and forgotten shipyards. He'd started with the Coast Guard's official signal books, then moved on to esoteric texts detailing historical maritime codes. The truth, when it finally hit him, was both subtle and terrifying. The markings on the buoy weren't a direct transcription of any known signal flag code. They were a distortion, a deliberate mimicry. Someone had taken the basic shapes and colors of the flags and twisted them, warped them into something else. But the underlying structure was there. It was a bastardized form of maritime communication, one designed to be recognized by those who knew what to look for, yet remain opaque to casual observation. He'd sketched out a comparison chart, overlaying the buoy's markings with standard signal flags. The distortions weren't random. They followed a pattern, a key. Applying that key, deciphering the twisted code, revealed the first layer of the message. It wasn't a single phrase, but 2 separate components. A date, the 14th of November 1988, and a string of coordinates. 1988. That was the year before Hemlock disappeared. A year Ben hadn't given much thought to. He ran the coordinates through a GPS plotting program. The result sent another jolt of cold fear through him. The location pinpointed a small, uninhabited island, a dozen miles off the coast, Widow's Point. Locals shunned the island, whispering stories of spectral lights, ghostly cries, and treacherous currents. It had earned its name from the numerous shipwrecks that littered its rocky shores, claimed by sudden squalls and deceptive fog banks. It was a place of ill omen, a place best left undisturbed. He needed to talk to Finn Hemlock, Old Man Hemlock's son. He hadn't spoken to the man since the official inquest, and the encounter hadn't been pleasant. Finn had been openly hostile, blaming the Coast Guard Thiventy, and Ben specifically Thuindy for not finding his father. Finn Hemlock lived in a dilapidated cottage on the outskirts of Port Lament, a mirror image of the neglect that seemed to cling to the family. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling from the clapboard siding. A rusted lobster boat, the salty siren, sat listing in the driveway, a testament to better days. Ben found Finn splitting wood, his movements fueled by a simmering anger. The man was built like his father, stocky and broad-shouldered, but his face was etched with a permanent scowl. He hadn't aged well. "Haskell," Finn greeted, his voice a gravelly rasp. He didn't offer a handshake. "Finn, I need to ask you some questions." "About what?" "Digging up old ghosts. About your father. About 1988. Finn's grip tightened on the axe. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, despite the frigid air. "That is a closed book, Haskell. Been closed for a long time. You should leave it that way." "I found something, a buoy, with a message." Ben hesitated, deciding how much to reveal. It mentioned a date, the 14th of November, 1988, and a set of coordinates. They point to Widow. S point. Finn's face paled. He dropped the axe, the blade thudding into the woodpile. You stay away from Widow. S point. Haskell, you hear me? Stay away. Someone's trying to tell me something. Finn, about your father, about what happened out there. There is nothing to tell. He was a fisherman. He went out to sea and he didn't come back. It is simple as that. It doesn't feel simple. Your father was a careful man, experienced. He wouldn't have ignored a squall warning. Someone said he was involved in other things. Ben trailed off, remembering Ellie Mae's whispers. Finn's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, invading Ben's personal space. Ellie Mae talks too much. She always has. Don't listen to her ramblings. He lowered his voice, his tone laced with warning. My father had his secrets. We all do. Some secrets are better left buried. What secrets? Ben pressed, keeping his voice steady. Finn's jaw clenched. He looked away towards the churning grey sea. Things you wouldn't understand, things that don't concern you. Just let it go, Haskell, for your own sake. I can't. This message, it feels important. Someone is trying to reach me or warn me. Then you're a fool to be listening. You poke around in things that aren't yours, you're gonna get hurt. He turned abruptly and walked towards the cottage, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed like a final warning. Ben stood there, feeling the weight of Finn's hostility, the unspoken darkness that clung to the Hemlock family. He knew he hadn't gotten the full story. Finn was protecting something, or someone. Back at the boatworks, the storm had intensified. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the corrugated iron. Ben was barely noticing it. He was too engrossed in the images of Widow's Point, studying nautical charts, referencing them with historical records. He found a peculiar notation on an old hydrographic survey map of the area, dated 1942. A small, handwritten annotation near Widow. S point. Anomaly detected. Soin magnetic disturbance. The note was initialed J.H. Joseph Hemlock, Old Man Hemlock, S. father. He'd been a coast surveyor before becoming a fisherman. Another layer of connection, another thread to unravel. The bell above the door chimed again, startling Ben. This time it was Caleb Pritchard, a young lobsterman who fished the outer reaches of the bay. He carried another buoy, identical to the one Tiber had brought in earlier. Found this tangled in my traps, about 6 miles northeast of Monhegan, Caleb said, his face pale. Same kind of markings as the one Old Man Tiber brought you. Thought you'd want to see it. Ben felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Another buoy, another piece of the puzzle. He examined the new markings, comparing them to the first. The carvings mirrored the pattern, but they weren't the same. They were a continuation of the code, a new layer of the message. He quickly transcribed the new markings, applying the same deciphering key. The combined message was longer now, more cryptic. They are watching. The 14th of November 1988. The Serpent's Tooth. Beware the black tide. The Serpent's Tooth. Ben recognized the name. A treacherous rock formation, just off the coast of Widow's Point, notorious for its jagged peaks and unpredictable currents. What does it mean? Caleb asked, his voice trembling. He'd clearly sensed Ben's growing unease. Ben didn't answer. He was staring at the coordinates, at the image of Widow's Point on the chart. The island wasn't just a random location. It was a destination, a place of secrets. He thought of Finn's warning, of the dark hint of family secrets. He thought of the magnetic anomaly recorded decades ago, and he felt a creeping sensation that he was walking into a trap. He glanced back at the buoy, at the carved markings. He traced the shapes with his finger, remembering the cold dread that washed over him when he first saw them. That dread hadn't lessened. It had grown, festering into a chilling certainty. The coordinates pointed to Widow's Point, and Ben knew, with a sickening clarity, that he had no choice but to go. The sea clawed at the Marauder, Ben's 30-foot workboat, as he fought his way towards Widow's Point. The storm had escalated into a full-blown nor'easter, whipping the waves into frothing whitecaps. Each swell threatened to swallow the small vessel whole, and the wind shrieked a relentless warning. He'd ignored it, he had to. The spray stung his face, a frigid slap that mirrored the turmoil in his gut. He'd filed a cursory float plan, enough to satisfy Coast Guard regulations, but hadn't disclosed his true destination. He doubted they'd bother looking if he didn't return. Not after the whispers that still followed him from the Hemlock case. Widow's Point loomed out of the mist, a jagged silhouette against the turbulent sky. Approaching the island was like entering another world. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the crashing waves and the mournful cry of gulls. He found a small, sheltered cove on the leeward side of the island, managing to beach the Marauder with a bone. Jarring thud. The shore was littered with wreckage, and splintered wood, rusted metal, fragments of forgotten ships swallowed by the sea. He grabbed a waterproof pack containing a flashlight, a multi-tool, and a pistol funty, a precaution he hadn't taken in years. The gun felt heavy, alien in his hand, a stark reminder of how much his life had changed. The interior of the island was a dense thicket of scrub pine and gnarled trees, their branches twisted and contorted by the constant wind. He navigated through the undergrowth, following a faint animal trail that led upwards towards the island's rocky spine. He felt watched, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. After an hour of scrambling, he found it, a clearing concealed amongst a cluster of boulders, the remnants of a long-abandoned camp. Rusting tools lay scattered on the ground, a pickaxe, a shovel, a pair of battered pliers, a fire pit choked with ash and overgrown with weeds, and most significantly the decaying remains of a small wooden shack. The shack was little more than a skeletal frame. Its walls collapsed, its roof caved in, but inside, amidst the debris, he found a treasure, a waterproof logbook, its pages brittle with age and dampness. The handwriting was shaky, faded, but legible. It belonged to Old Man Hemlock. The initial entries were mundane, detailing fishing hauls, weather conditions, repairs to the sea serpent. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became more sporadic, more disturbed. Hemlock wrote of strange sightings, lights on the water, unexplained disturbances in the currents. He spoke of a growing unease, a feeling of being followed. And then, several weeks before his disappearance, he began to write about deliveries, smuggled goods, Cuban cigars, Canadian whiskey, untaxed electronics. Hemlock had been running contraband. The logbook didn't reveal who he was working with, only referring to them as the collector, a shadowy figure who offered substantial sums of money in exchange for Hemlock's discretion. The collector insists on Widow's Point for the drop, Hemlock wrote in a panicked entry dated the 8th of November, 1988. Says it is the only place secure enough. This doesn't feel right. Too exposed, too many eyes. The last entry, penned just 2 days before his disappearance, was chilling. They know I'm questioning things. The collector sent a message, a warning, said I should remember my place. I fear this is the last I write. Ben closed the logbook, his hands trembling. Hemlock hadn't simply disappeared at sea. He'd been involved in something dangerous, something that had ultimately led to his death. A snap of a twig behind him shattered the silence. He whirled around, pistol drawn. A figure emerged from the trees. Tall, masked, clad in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. Put the gun down, Haskell, a voice snarled, muffled by the mask. You shouldn't be here. Ben didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, they lunged, moving with a speed and agility that belied their size. Ben sidestepped the attack, narrowly avoiding a brutal blow to the head. He returned fire, hitting the figure in the shoulder. They grunted in pain, but kept coming. A desperate struggle ensued. Ben, hampered by the uneven terrain and the driving rain, found himself outmatched. The assailant was relentless, pressing their attack with a cold, calculated ferocity. He managed to disarm them, kicking the pistol away, but they tackled him to the ground, pinning him beneath their weight. Ben fought back with a primal fury, striking, kicking, clawing. He managed to break free, scrambling to his feet. The assailant was momentarily stunned, giving Ben a chance to bolt. He sprinted towards the marauder, dodging trees, scrambling over rocks, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He could hear the assailant crashing through the undergrowth behind him, gaining ground. He reached the boat, fumbling with the ignition key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. He threw the boat into gear and gunned it, leaving the island and his assailant behind. As he steered the marauder back towards the mainland, he realized something was missing. He patted his pack, the logbook. It was gone, stolen during the struggle. Despair washed over him. He'd found the key, the link to the truth, and now it was lost. But then his hand brushed against something hidden in the interior of his jacket, a small, rolled-up parchment. He hadn't noticed it before. He unfurled it, his hands shaking. It was a maritime chart, meticulously drawn, depicting the waters around Widow's Point. But it wasn't a navigational chart. It was covered in a series of coded symbols, identical to the ones he'd seen carved on the buoys. The assailant hadn't taken everything. They'd been after the logbook, yes, but they hadn't realized he'd found something else, something even more valuable. He stared at the chart, at the intricate web of symbols. It was a map, but not of islands or coastlines. It was a map of secrets, and he knew with a chilling certainty that deciphering it would lead him to the truth, no matter how dangerous. The assailant hadn't been there to scare him off. They were trying to protect a secret, and Ben now had a piece of the puzzle they desperately wanted back. The rain hammered against the windows of Eleanor Vance's bookshop, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic pace of Ben's thoughts. Port Lament hadn't seen a storm like this in decades. It felt deliberate, a tightening noose around his neck. Eleanor, a woman whose knowledge of Port Lament's history was rivaled only by her sharp wit, traced a finger across the coded chart. Her spectacles perched precariously on her nose, magnifying the intricate symbols. The shop, a labyrinth of towering bookshelves and dusty artifacts, smelled of old paper and forgotten stories. It was a sanctuary, a temporary reprieve from the storm brewing outside and the one closing in around him. These aren't nautical charts, not in the traditional sense, she said, her voice a thoughtful murmur. They're territorial markers, but not for land, for hidden coves, inlets, places difficult to access by larger vessels. Ben had explained everything. 40, the buoy messages, the camp on Widow's Point, the logbook, the attack. Eleanor had listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grim. She hadn't dismissed his story as the ramblings of a traumatized man, as others had. She'd seen the urgency in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. I've come across references to this network in old shipping manifests and Coast Guard records, she continued. During the Cold War, this entire coastline was a hotbed for smuggling. Everything from Soviet technology to Cuban cigars. It was a shadow economy operating just beneath the surface. And the symbols? Ben asked, his voice tight. Eleanor pointed to a series of stylized anchors and crescent moons. These correspond to specific coves, inlets. Each symbol represents a designated drop point, It is a remarkably sophisticated system designed to be discreet and difficult to decipher. She referenced the symbols with an ancient chart she unearthed from the town's historical archives, a chart detailing the coastline as it appeared in the early 1960s. As she matched the symbols to locations, a disturbing pattern emerged. The network of coves centered around one family, the Holbrooks. The Holbrooks, old money, old power. They owned half the businesses in Port Lament, 50, the bank, the newspaper, the lumber mill. They wielded influence like a weapon, subtly controlling the town's politics and economy for generations. The Holbrooks were deeply involved in the smuggling operation, Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. Their patriarch, Alistair Holbrook, practically ran the show. He used his shipping company as a front, bringing in goods from Europe and Cuba under the guise of legitimate trade. Hemlock discovered their operation, Ben said, remembering the panicked entries in the logbook. That is why they wanted him silenced. Eleanor nodded, her gaze meeting Ben's. According to local law, Hemlock threatened to go to the authorities. He'd gathered evidence enough to expose the entire network. He was a proud man, fiercely independent. He wouldn't back down. She retrieved a faded newspaper clipping from a file cabinet. The headline read, "Local fisherman lost at sea." The article recounted the details of Old Man Hemlock's disappearance, almost identical to the official report, but a small annotation in the margin, handwritten in Eleanor's meticulous script, revealed a different story. The Coast Guard investigation was compromised, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Alistair Holbrook personally intervened, using his connections to stifle the inquiry. The investigation was quickly closed, deemed an accidental drowning. Ben felt a surge of rage. Hemlock hadn't died in a tragic accident. He'd been murdered, silenced by a powerful family to protect their illicit empire. The Holbrooks are still running things in this town, Eleanor said, her eyes filled with a weary resignation. They've cleaned up their act, diversified their holdings, but the power, the control, it remains. A sudden, jarring crash from outside shattered the atmosphere of subdued dread. Ben and Eleanor exchanged a worried glance. What was that? Eleanor asked. Before Ben could answer, the door to the bookshop burst open, revealing Sheriff Brody, his face grim and resolute. Two deputies flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Ben Haskell," Brody said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You're under arrest." "What for?" Ben asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he'd left in the Marauder. Brody said, his eyes unwavering, "Your boatworks was set on fire an hour ago. Witnesses saw you fleeing the scene." Ben stared at him dumbfounded. "That is a lie. I haven't been near my shop all day." "We have evidence to the contrary, Mr. Haskell, multiple eyewitness accounts, and a canister of gasoline found in your truck." It was a setup, a blatant attempt to discredit him, to silence him. He looked at Eleanor, pleading for understanding. She met his gaze, her expression a mixture of shock and sorrow. "Ben, this is about Hemlock, isn't it?" Ben demanded, his voice rising. "The Holbrooks are trying to get rid of me." Brody's face remained impassive. "We're simply following the evidence, Mr. Haskell. Now come with us peacefully." Ben knew arguing was pointless. The Holbrooks controlled the police force, the courts, the entire town. He was alone, framed for a crime he didn't commit. He allowed the deputies to handcuff him, his mind racing. He needed to get out of Port Lament, to expose the truth before the Holbrooks buried it forever. As they led him out of the bookshop, he caught Eleanor's eye one last time. She slipped him a small folded piece of paper. "Get to Bar Harbor," she mouthed, her voice almost inaudible. "Contact my cousin, Samuel. He'll help you." He slipped the paper into his pocket, his heart pounding. He glanced back, seeing Brody and the deputies pushing him into the patrol car. The storm raged on, washing away any hope of a fair trial. any chance of justice. He was a fugitive now, hunted by the very authorities sworn to protect him. Then a chilling thought struck him. He hadn't thought to warn Eleanor. He'd been so focused on his own survival, he'd forgotten about her. She knew too much. She'd helped him. The Holbrooks wouldn't hesitate to silence her too. Ben leaned forward in his seat, his eyes burning with a desperate urgency. He had to get to Bar Harbor. He had to warn Eleanor. He had to expose the truth. But he knew, with a cold dread, that he was running out of time. The rusted Ford pickup rattled along the deserted logging roads, each bump and groan a testament to its age and the urgency of their flight. Rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the already treacherous landscape. Ben gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, glancing at Eleanor beside him. She looked pale, shaken, but determined. "Samuel's place is another 30 miles, she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. He lives off the grid, mostly keeps to himself. Samuel Vance, Eleanor's cousin, was a legend in Port Lament, a former Coast Guard mechanic who'd vanished into the wilderness years ago, disillusioned with the corruption he'd witnessed. He was a recluse, a survivalist, and, according to Eleanor, a master of evasion. They found his cabin nestled deep in the woods, a ramshackle structure built from salvaged timber and surrounded by a network of security cameras and motion sensors. Samuel, a wiry man with eyes that missed nothing, greeted them with a gruff assessment. "Trouble follows you too, I presume." Eleanor quickly filled him in. Samuel listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "The Holbrooks always thought they were bad news. Been watching them for years, collecting information." He gestured towards a cluttered room filled with files, documents, and electronic equipment. "I've got a lot of dirt, enough to bury them." Over the next 2 days, they meticulously sifted through Samuel's collection. They uncovered a trove of incriminating evidence, CD falsified shipping manifests, offshore bank accounts, and detailed records of bribes paid to local officials. They even found copies of Hemlock's original logbook, spirited away by a sympathetic Coast Guard officer years ago. The Holbrooks had been running a sophisticated smuggling operation for decades, laundering money, evading taxes, and silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. "This is enough to bring them down," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But getting it to the right people." Ben tried contacting the state police, but every avenue led back to the Holbrooks' influence. Key investigators were either openly dismissive or strangely reluctant to pursue the evidence. It became clear that they couldn't rely on the authorities. They had to go public. "We need to get this information to a journalist," Ben said. "Someone who isn't afraid to take on the Holbrooks." As they were preparing to leave Samuel's cabin, a flash of headlights in the driveway shattered their fragile sense of security. A black SUV, its windows tinted, was slowly approaching. "Company," Samuel growled, grabbing a shotgun from under his bed. "Looks like the Holbrooks are getting impatient." A tense standoff ensued. The SUV's occupants, 2 hulking men in dark suits, emerged, their faces impassive. They didn't bother with threats or warnings. They opened fire, scattering the attackers with a well-aimed blast. Ben and Eleanor scrambled into the pickup, Samuel covering their retreat. They sped away, tires spinning in the mud, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets. A harrowing chase followed, winding along the rugged coastline. The Holbrooks' men pursued them relentlessly, their SUV gaining ground. Ben drove like a man possessed, dodging potholes, navigating treacherous curves, pushing the aging pickup to its limit. Just when they thought they'd lost their pursuers, they ran into an unexpected ally. Finn Hemlock, driving a beat-up lobster boat, intercepted the SUV, ramming it into a rocky outcrop. "Figured you could use a hand," he said, his face grim. "I've been a fool to stay silent for so long." He'd uncovered evidence that his father hadn't simply disappeared at sea. He'd been deliberately targeted by the Holbrooks, silenced because he'd threatened to reveal their operation. "What do you know, Finn?" Ben asked, his voice strained. "My father kept records, hidden ones, about the smuggling, the meetings, the payments. He suspected something was wrong, and he started gathering evidence. He hid it in the Holbrook estate in the old library." The Holbrook estate, Blackwood Manor, was a sprawling Gothic mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was a symbol of the family's wealth and power, a fortress protected by security gates, surveillance cameras, and a small army of private guards. "That is suicide," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "It is a fortress. It is the only way," Ben said, his gaze fixed on the looming mansion. "Everything we need is in there, the final piece of the puzzle." "I know the layout of the grounds," Finn said. "My father used to work there as a handyman. I can get us inside." Under the cover of darkness, they approached Blackwood Manor, Finn leading the way. He guided them through a network of hidden pathways and blind spots, bypassing the security cameras and guards. They managed to infiltrate the estate, slipping into the mansion unnoticed. The library was a cavernous room filled with antique books, ornate furniture, and a palpable sense of history. It smelled of dust and decay. They searched for hours, meticulously examining every shelf, every cabinet, every hidden compartment. Finally, Finn discovered a secret panel behind a bookshelf. He pressed a hidden latch, revealing a small, concealed safe. Inside the safe, they found a single item, a small, leather-bound journal. It belonged to Alistair Holbrook. The journal was a detailed account of the smuggling operation, a confession of decades of criminal activity, and Fuvi most damningly Thuvanitoin, a chilling admission of Hemlock's murder. "This is it," Ben said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and dread. "This is the evidence we need." Just as he finished speaking, a voice shattered the silence. "Well, well, well, what have we here?" Alistair Holbrook stood in the doorway, flanked by two menacing figures. He smiled, a cold, predatory grin. "I must say, I'm impressed. You managed to get this far, but your little game is over." He gestured to his henchmen. "Take them into custody." Ben and Eleanor exchanged a desperate glance. They were trapped, outnumbered, facing the full might of the Holbrook Empire. The evidence was in their hands, but their freedom, their lives, hung precariously in the balance. They had a story to tell, a truth to reveal, that a powerful family would do anything to keep hidden. And now, Ben's gaze swept over Eleanor, and a chilling realization dawned on him. They weren't just trying to recover the journal. This wasn't about protecting a secret. They were hunting him. And now, Eleanor was in danger too. Storm was a physical manifestation of the chaos within Blackwood Manor. Rain lashed against the windows. Wind howled like a tormented spirit, and the power flickered intermittently, plunging the mansion into brief pockets of darkness. It was the perfect cover for a desperate gamble. Ben, Eleanor, and Finn moved like shadows through the opulent corridors, guided by Finn's intimate knowledge of the estate's hidden passages. They'd slipped past the remaining guards. Utilizing a diversion Samuel had engineered, Thuvinder carefully timed false alarm that drew most of the security personnel to the opposite end of the mansion. They found Alistair Holbrook in his study, a mahogany-panelled room overlooking the tempestuous sea. He was calmly pouring himself a glass of brandy, seemingly unfazed by their intrusion. "I expected you," he said, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with menace. "You're remarkably persistent, Mr. Haskell, but persistence rarely triumphs over power." He gestured towards his two henchmen, who materialized from the shadows, blocking the doorway. "You've unearthed unpleasant truths, I admit. But truth is a malleable thing. It can be shaped, distorted, buried. You murdered old man Hemlock," Ben said, his voice tight with controlled fury. He held Alistair's gaze, refusing to back down. You silenced him because he threatened to expose your operation. Alistair chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Hemlock was a loose end, a liability he knew too much. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Greater good, Eleanor scoffed. You call smuggling, bribery, and murder the greater good. I call it survival, Alistair retorted. This town, this state, this country, it is all built on compromises, on the unspoken understanding that some men are allowed to operate outside the law. I simply understood that better than most. Finn stepped forward, his fists clenched. You used my father. You exploited his skills, his knowledge of the sea, and then you threw him away like garbage. Your father was a useful pawn, Alistair said dismissively. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Ben lunged, tackling one of the henchmen, while Finn engaged the other in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Eleanor, despite her fear, sprang into action, grabbing Alistair's phone and smashing it against the desk. A fierce struggle erupted. Ben, fueled by years of pent-up frustration and a burning desire for justice, fought with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. Finn, driven by grief and anger, unleashed a relentless barrage of punches and kicks. Despite being outnumbered, they managed to overpower the henchmen, disarming them and pinning them to the ground. Alistair, realizing he was losing control, reached for a pistol hidden in his desk drawer. Before he could fire, Eleanor knocked the gun from his hand, sending it clattering across the floor. It is over. Holbrook, Ben said, his voice cold and resolute. Your empire is finished. They secured Alistair and his henchmen, then proceeded to copy all the evidence Ben siphoned, the journal, the financial records. Hemlock's logbook sefted onto a secure flash drive. Simultaneously, Eleanor contacted Lena Hansen, an investigative journalist known for her unwavering integrity and willingness to expose corruption. Within hours, Lena Hansen's story broke. The Exposine Food, the Holbrook Shadow, detailed the family's decades-long criminal enterprise, laying bare their network of corruption and their ruthless pursuit of power. The article went viral, igniting a firestorm of public outrage. The authorities, unable to ignore the overwhelming evidence, were forced to act. Alistair Holbrook and his accomplices were arrested, charged with a litany of crimes. The Holbrook Empire began to crumble, its foundations eroded by decades of deceit and greed. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Corrupt officials were exposed and removed from office. Businesses linked to the Holbrooks were investigated. The town of Port Lament, shaken to its core, began the arduous process of rebuilding trust and accountability. Days later, Ben stood on a windswept cliff overlooking the sea, the storm having finally subsided. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a golden glow on the rugged coastline. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The weight of the past had finally been lifted. Hemlock's name had been cleared. Justice had been served. The ghosts that had haunted him for years had finally been laid to rest. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It is over, Ben," she said, her voice filled with relief. "You did it. We did it," Ben corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you, or Finn, or Samuel." Finn joined them, his face etched with a quiet sadness. "My father would have been proud." Ben had decided to stay in Port Lament. He repaired the boatworks, using the insurance money from the arson to rebuild it even better than before. He found a purpose, a sense of belonging. He picked up Hemlock's logbook, flipping through the brittle pages. He paused on a seemingly insignificant entry. Dated the 5th of November, 1988. "Spoke to old Silas today. He thinks there is something buried off Widow. Point, something bigger than anything we've seen before." He mentioned a legend, a Spanish galleon, lost during a hurricane in the 17th century, said it was carrying a king's ransom in gold and jewels. Alistair Holbrook's grandfather. The connection was almost too absurd to consider. Was Hemlock's death connected to something other than smuggling? Was there another secret, even older and more valuable, buried beneath the waves? Ben looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, its depths concealing untold mysteries. The storm was over, but the sea, he knew, would always hold its secrets, and a small part of him, the part that couldn't quite let go of the search, wondered if his journey was truly over. The weight of water, he suspected, would continue to call to him, beckoning him towards the unknown.